Welcome to another edition of the Mail Time Podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director of FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Doctor, thank you so much for joining.
Great to be with you.
And I just will add, before we really get going, that this book, State of Failure, as I was a college rabble-rouser, the first person I ever brought to speak at Brandeis University was Dr. Schanzer. So really full circle here. I want to get into a number of things around the Middle East, but as I just mentioned to you before we started recording here, I'm curious, as a professional analyst and someone who's been in D.C. a long time, you testified before in Congress on September 27th, 2023, regarding Pay for Slay, Taylor Force Act, and there was one sentence in there, and again, everyone, no one is, everyone seemed to kind of get this a little confused, but there was this idea that Hamas had a different strategy and that they were not interested in the rocket fire because of the consequences and what the damage would be for Gaza. How did everyone get it so wrong?
So I'll tell you a story. As I was preparing for that testimony in September of 2023, I did my usual research and I wrote my draft, wrote my testimony, and then I reached out to a guy that I had known in the Israeli system, pretty high up, long time watcher of the Palestinian space, and we spoke for a good half hour on the West Bank, which was the focus of the hearing. And then I said, before I let you go, just, because we talked about, Mahmoud Abbas and Pay for Slay and how he was, 18 years into a 4-year term and corruption and all that stuff. And I just said, we haven't talked about Gaza once. I said, what's going on there? And he said, well, actually, we're very optimistic. We think that Yahya Sinwar is pragmatic and that he's trying to improve the lives of Gazans. And we think that we have a path forward for a time, and we're going to let this experiment play out. And I remember telling him that it didn't sound like Hamas to me. And he said, that's what we're seeing, and, we have evidence to prove it. And I said, okay. And so the line that I had, I don't even remember what the line was, but I put it in there as sort of an acknowledgement of where I thought the Israeli system was at the time. But what I will say, and so I guess to some extent, maybe I shouldn't have included that in the testimony, although generally speaking, I like to include a wide range of voices from the folks that I interview before I, before I get up and testify. And a lot of that stuff, by the way, was, long-standing research that I've been doing on my own. But what's actually remarkable to me is the number of people that have come to me afterwards to talk about Qatar, Turkey, the Hezbollah threat. These were things that I'd been talking about for a really long time, and people thought I was nuts to be talking about, like, the Qataris. Why do you care about their American allies, right? We have our largest...
They interview on Tucker Carlson now.
Right. Yeah. And so what's amazing to me right now is the extent to which people have woken up to some of these challenges. But I will just say that it's hard for any of us to get anything right when the Israeli system was so wrong.
Absolutely. I guess I deliberately didn't read that passage because I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, got you. Oh, hey, it's not how it works. But just how did they get it so wrong? Because they are convinced, and they're giving you information 10 days before this happens, that Sinwar, and I'll bring up that sentence just because we mentioned it here, just saying that he is rethinking its practice. He's rethinking the practice of provoking Israel with rocket fire. So how does someone pull that off? Where all of these really smart people,
I'll tell
you see it.
I'll tell you two things that I heard after the fact, sitting with some guys within the intelligence world in Israel. One guy told me that they actually had all of the information that they needed in order to sniff out the plot of 10/7, but they didn't believe it. So in other words, they didn't, even as they heard it and saw it, they didn't think that it was feasible that Hamas would try to pull it off. They believed that the threat was just so diminished that Hamas was really only a tactical problem, that that it was just not something that was feasible. The other thing that I heard on pretty good authority was that Sinwar and a handful of others understood that they were being listened to in wherever it was, and they were deliberately feeding misinformation to the intelligence collectors in Israel. So in other words, they went out of their way to throw them off track, even as the Israelis were picking up information in other places showing that there was, in fact, a severe threat. So
yeah, I don't know if you caught Ronan Bergman this weekend. He said he actually wrote a piece saying that Mohammed Sinwar deliberately dug tunnels, knowing that they wouldn't get through the fence, but that Israel would have to spend so much time monitoring them.
Yeah, there definitely, I think, there was, I think, a realization in Israel that Hamas had more game than anybody had understood. That from an intelligence perspective, they were more sophisticated. From a communications perspective, they were more sophisticated. Obviously, with the amount of underground infrastructure that they had created, they were more sophisticated. With the way that their fighters were able to invade Israel and operate on a coordinated basis on the morning of October 7th, that showed that they were far more sophisticated. It's interesting. I was actually just meeting with a former senior Israeli Air Force official earlier today, and we were talking about how Hamas has always been identified as a tactical threat. Meaning, if you look at the matrix, right, there's the tactical threat, that's Hamas. Then there's the strategic threat, that's Hezbollah. And then there's the existential threat, and that's Iran. Guess where everyone in Israel wants to work? Do they want to work on the tactical threat, or do they want to work on the strategic or existential threat? So what you have was this march of analysts and operatives and people in the security world that all want to devote themselves to Israel's gravest threats, and fewer people wanting to address what they believed was tactical. And in the process, nobody figured out that Hamas had evolved from a tactical to a strategic threat. And that is, I think, the story that at some point needs to be told. No one has yet to recount the intelligence failures, the assumptions, the wrong-headed assumptions on the part of Israelis. And I think the way in which the analyst class, both in Israel but also here, folks took that stuff as, canon. It was Bible. You don't question it because it's coming from within a system that was so vaunted, so respected, that how could they ever get it wrong? Obviously, we see now the fallibility of the Israelis. I think they've got their mojo back. But I do think that they are still tinkering quite a bit with whatever their national security strategy will look like in the future.
And they also have a very unique circumstance in which the conversation that they're having with the Israeli public can be heard across the world, and it's monitored very, very closely. So sometimes there's this idea that they don't want to speak about certain issues, even if they invoke national security concerns very heavily, which impacts the conversation and impacts the way people think about things. And in some ways, they're trying to make the public feel better, and in other ways, they're speaking to the enemy. But it's a very, very complicated messaging system there, and and they're trying to show. They obviously have to show strength, and anytime you look a little bit weak, they see it as a vulnerability. So, which it is. So, it's a huge challenge, a huge communication.
But there's also the politics of this too, Daniel,
Yes.
which I think really cannot, we can't ignore it. You have a government that was, guilty of the greatest intelligence failure in Israeli history, and you still have leaders that refuse to acknowledge their complicity in that. And they don't want to share that stuff. They don't want it broadcast. They don't want it talked about. And I think that's a reckoning that, has to happen. I am not sure when it will happen, but I think that it's probably one of the healthiest things that could take place in Israel. And I think every day we don't have it is probably a day that Israel remains vulnerable in some shape or form.
Right, and also the judicial reform issues that were going on before, the issues between Bibi and Yoav Gallant. There's so many factors behind everything that it's not just as simple as saying, okay, what happened on this day and who's taking responsibility in an isolated sense. There's a much bigger conversation. As an analyst, have you changed how you evaluate your relationship with intelligence sources and information gathering as a result of October 7th?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, look, I think number one, I feel actually more vindicated with the work that I've done than probably a lot of people after 10/7, because, the research that I had done had identified a lot of the threats, a lot of the challenges coming out of Lebanon, the precision-guided munitions and the challenges there, although I think the Israelis actually proved me wrong to some extent by showing how vulnerable Hezbollah was after they finally decided to drop the gloves and fight back. It took months, but I think once they did fight back, I was shocked at the speed in which Hezbollah began to crack. But between the work that I've done on Hamas and Hezbollah, and then actually also some of the campus-related issues, the Hamas influence on campus here in the United States, all of those things, I felt pretty good about what I had done, the work that I had assembled up until that point. But if anything, what it did is it showed me that I need to continue to talk to everybody. And that's actually been for me the most, I think perhaps the most important sort of guide for me is that I've had a rule since 10/7 of taking every meeting that I've been offered. I may need to postpone for a week or two because I'm traveling or because I don't have time, but I need to hear every little scrap. When somebody says they have something interesting they want to share with me, I want to listen. Now, sometimes those meetings don't last very long. It's like, okay, got it, thanks, really not helpful. But sometimes, you end up hearing something that opens your eyes to a whole new area of study. And I think, I'm 52 years old. I think I'm officially a boomer by your standards. I sort of at one point was like, oh, well, I have my network and I know who I can rely on. I don't actually think about things in that way anymore. I think that the people that I know and that I trust are great, but their sources are going to be limited just like mine are. And so I'm constantly trying to broaden the aperture to the extent that I can.
And I think also if you just look at some of the 10/7 issues with that intelligence officer V, and she was actually dismissed from some of her claims because of the position she was in. It wasn't that what she was saying was implausible. It was just that they're saying that the scope of what her department was, this was outside of that scope. She's offering kind of a strategic angle, not just collecting. So,
yeah.
and I found that myself talking to certain people where it might not be their position, but they just hang around enough that they know something that is quite interesting.
I'll say this though, my first day in government, I remember I was working at the Treasury Department tracking terror finance, and I remember telling my boss at the time that I wanted to do some work while I was waiting for my clearance, and that there were things that I could do. Back then, my Arabic was pretty good, and I could, scour the web for possible bank account numbers that could be used in tracking terror finance. And I was told very clearly, I mean, the first words out of his mouth were, no one ever got in trouble in government for doing too little. And then what came after that was sort of a diatribe about how we're asked to do things in government in keeping with the confines of our specific position, and that we don't do more than that. And so bureaucracies are deeply, deeply flawed. I actually happen to think that the Israeli bureaucracy is more nimble than most, but that doesn't mean that it's not flawed. And so I think there's something to be learned there for sure.
Okay, I'll get into discussing Israeli bureaucracies with you later, because yeah, it's a bigger can of worms. What do we make of yesterday's Adam Boehler, if I'm pronouncing that correctly? As an observer and someone who's been paying attention every day, I have no idea what he's doing. Do you have any insight to that?
Look, I don't know if I see a distinct strategy right now. What I can say is that we are watching the Trump administration take two different approaches at the exact same time as it relates to Iran and its proxy network. They are, on the one hand, engaging and talking with the enemy, as we would call them, and on the other side, they are threatening to destroy them, sometimes in veiled ways, sometimes in very open ways. So Trump basically says, "Shalom Hamas," in a tweet, and that kind of, everybody's eyes go wide and they go, wow, okay, the president is directly threatening the terror group. Turns out he's also talking to them at the same time. He is simultaneously playing good cop and bad cop. He's not letting someone else do it, right? He's doing both jobs himself. That is something. That's something that we don't often see. Now, whether
do you think there's a real strategy?
I don't know if there's a strategy. I think he's doing both, and I think he's waiting to see which. I mean, is it a strategy to find out which one works? I guess it's kind of a gambit, I suppose. Look, it all could blow up, but if it blows up, all we're doing is going back to war, which I think is a foregone conclusion anyway, because Israel did not want to go into phase 2 of the hostage deal. There was no inclination whatsoever on the part of the Israelis to do that. So what Trump is trying to do right now is to buy time. I think there's two problems here. If you ask me just sort of analytically what's going on, the first is that Trump is legitimizing Iran and its proxy in Gaza. I don't think that we should be doing that. I don't think anybody should be doing that. I think engaging with these two actors is probably ill-advised. And I think the other thing that's happening is that this entire process, forget Iran for a minute, but just engaging with Hamas, giving them a seat at the table. I will say the good news is Qatar's cut out of the process, which I very much appreciate. I like them being on the outside looking in. However, I also think that Hamas is getting days for free in this ceasefire without having to pay. They're not releasing hostages. They're not, they're not moving the needle in any way that would lead us to a better outcome. And that's just because they know that as long as Trump is engaged and he's trying to get an extension of the ceasefire or get them to leave Gaza or whatever it is that he's trying to get out of them right now, they know that at least they can be comfortable sitting where they are for the time being. So it's given them a sense of complacency and a sense of legitimacy. That's where I disagree with what's going on. But, I guess I'm not ruling out the wisdom of this just yet.
Do you think there's any chance that Hamas actually gives up all of the hostages in a negotiated settlement?
I'm pessimistic about that. I tend to think not, but look, this war has surprised me in more ways than I can count. There are things that have occurred during this war that I just did not have on my bingo card. So, and Trump's unpredictability, it's a possibility, or I think it's a low one, that he can do this. But I do think that, look, let's get down to let's strip it all down to the studs. Hamas is on the verge of extinction. If Israel goes back into Gaza and fights this war, it's going to be fighting against somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 fighters, most of whom are young men who have, probably just picked up an AK-47 or an RPG over the last several months. These are not the highly trained Radwan-type forces or Nukhba forces that invaded Israel on 10/7. These are not trained, right? So they're almost certainly going to lose. Israel's going to have fewer reservations about bombing underground tunnels because there are fewer hostages at this point. They know that they are not long for this world. So the question is, do they try to get out of Gaza, sort of like the way that the PLO did in Lebanon in the early 1980s? And is that the negotiation? Or do they think they can fight to the finish? If they fight to the finish, this is Alamo time, right? This is like they're going to get crushed. And by the way, it's funny, I know a lot of people in our world that are like, oh, I can't wait to see that. That is going to be some grim stuff to watch. It's a brutal war that we are on the precipice of watching here.
I'm freaking out every day because I know the human cost on the Israeli side. So and I'm not one of these naive or cynical people that's saying, oh, Bibi's marching because he can't wait for war and he wants it and he loves it. And I'm not. Again, you have certain segments of the Haaretz community that's how they write everything. But I'm saying, it's a very horrible thing, and I am dreading that reality. But I do think it's coming.
Yeah, and by the way, when it comes, the next thing you need to understand is this war does not take place in isolation in the Middle East. There will be other fronts that open or reopen. I mean, I think the West Bank is already heating up, and I think it could become a front upon itself. I expect the Houthis to get back into the action. They've already threatened to do so, and I think it's a legitimate threat. Then you've got other, I don't think Syria gets into the act. I don't think Iraq gets into the act. I don't think Hezbollah gets into the act. Iran itself, that's a maybe. Weak as they are in terms of air defenses, they still have a lot of ballistic missiles at their disposal, and Israel has a limited capacity to strike. But we could be looking at a 3 or 4 front war in addition to the grim war that awaits in Gaza. And that is, I don't think that's fully baked into people's calculus right now.
I think people are also enjoying the few weeks of reprieve now, of kind of a normal, but at the same time, it's really not so normal. And I'm sitting here just confused as to how people are enjoy. And I don't want to say they're kind of they enjoy being able to tune out for a second.
Look, this is human nature.
Right.
You got to understand. You take people out of a stressful situation and you start to give them the opportunity to breathe again. They're going to take it. And they're going to consider it to be the new normal. I think it's important to remember that Israel has not repealed its state of war. It is still on war footing. There are still grave dangers out there that await. And as I always remind people in my own podcast, that wars only consistently produce one thing. And that's unintended consequences. And you've got to remember that once this thing starts up again, nobody knows where it goes. And so you should be nervous. It's not to say that Israel isn't the strongest, power in the region and that they're not incredibly capable, and man, have they, found a way to get back off their backs and to get back on their feet and to fight in a way that I think every Israeli is proud of. But that doesn't mean that this next phase is going to be easy or simple. I think we're going to see a lot of complexities creep into this picture.
You said you don't think Hezbollah will get back into the game. How do you analyze Hezbollah's standing right now?
Look, they've got a new leader, Naim Qassem, who's not much of a leader at all. This is a guy that's been a media person. He's sort of the Goebbels to Nasrallah, if you will. So not exactly a born military leader. And I think he's, still getting his feet under him. You had the Operation Castration, or the Beeper Operation, whatever you want to call it, that took out a large number of the commanders that would be leading the charge in the fight. The massive arsenal that existed before this war, some 150 to 180,000 projectiles, there's a third of that left. And look, a third's still a lot, right? You're still looking at, let's say, 50,000 projectiles that can be fired at Israel. But then comes the question of who's going to fire them, how many people are raising their hand for that job, especially as the international community is breathing down the neck of the Lebanese government, trying to restore some sense of order after the country had been gutted by Iran and its top proxy. So, I think I don't want to rule out a return to war by Hezbollah, but it does seem less likely right now, given the weakened state that they're in. Look, with all of these actors, there's a certain measure of suicidal tendencies if they get back into this. For Hamas, it's suicidal. They may survive in some shape or form, but they're not going to come out of this well. Hezbollah, similarly, very weak, maybe more in the tank than Hamas, but not a lot. Shiite militias in Syria are gone, so there's nothing to do there, or there are few of them left. In Iraq, it's an interesting question, but you got to even remember the Iraqi militias have had a brush with Trump. These are the guys that watched as Qasem Soleimani got whacked in 2020, along with a number of their leaders. I don't know if they want to mess with Trump again. I think it's an interesting question. I think they might be deterred. I think. And then it's the Houthis that I think are the wild card here, because I think they are suicidal. They don't care, and they're willing to take it all the way, I guess. But I do get a sense that if they start firing at Israel and then start firing at American ships on the Red Sea, this will be Trump's first brush with an aggressor in his second term. My sense is he's going to want to make an example of them. And so, again, I use the word suicidal. I think it's probably hazardous to the health of the Houthis to do this. And again, if Iran decides to get into the action, the Israelis have taken out all their air defenses, and there's a lot of damage that can be done. It won't bring down the regime, but man, will they be limping after the next round of fighting? I would tend to think so.
Do you think that's a genuine objective, though, of Israel? I know they might say it out loud, but do you think that they're actively working to bring down the Iranian regime?
I think the Israelis have come to an understanding now. It took a while that no one else is going to do it for them. So supporting elements that are opposed to the regime, yeah, I think I think they're actively seeking them out. And certainly, you've seen Bibi speak to the people of Iran, exhorting them to do exactly that. And I think that's incredibly positive. Just even the psychological I think he's been living in the supreme leader's head rent-free now for some time since that speech. So I think there's something very positive there. But I think the biggest thing is that the Israelis understand that there's a window of weakness, as I would call it. They have somewhere between 5 and 8 months where the air defenses are going to remain down, and that weakness is still going to be on full display. And that's where I think the Israelis have some big choices. Do they go it alone? Do they try to do it with the U.S.? Do they try to, pull off something that's never been done before militarily that we can't even imagine, but only Israelis come up with it, which is sort of their brand? I don't know how they proceed next, but I do know that everyone right now smells opportunity, and I feel stressed with every day that goes by that Israel doesn't take advantage of this. I mean, when I look back at 10/7, I would say that Israel was lucky. Is not because Israel suffered as many casualties as it did in the kidnappings, etc., but I mean, Hamas thought that it was going to get the full support of the rest of the Iranian proxy network. So they thought that Hezbollah would join, and the Houthis and the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and Iran would do it too. And if everybody fired at Israel all at once, and there were invasions coming from multiple borders, Israel may not have lasted the day. At minimum, they would have lost territory. It was that mistake that ultimately allowed Israel to get up off its back and to fight and to start to win, which is, I think, where Israel is at the moment. When you think about right now the vulnerability of Iran, this is a massive opportunity. And it would be a shame if Israel didn't take advantage of it. It'd be a shame if the United States and other allies didn't take advantage of it too. This regime, which has been nothing but just poison for the international community since it was founded in 1979, is now at its weakest state. It is at its most vulnerable that we have seen probably maybe since the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. So the question is, who's going to exploit it and how? And right now, Israel seems to be waiting for a green light from Trump. Trump seems to be enthralled with the idea of a negotiated settlement. I fear that the sands of this hourglass are slipping through very quickly.
I'll also add that the reservists in the Israeli army, those days are adding up as well, and there's only so long you can ask so many people to be on standby all of the time. So the longer these things drag out, the longer people's lives are on hold. And
yeah.
That's also a challenge in Israeli society.
No doubt. And you can hear from folks the frustrations growing, the questions about timeline. It's one of the reasons why you're seeing people maybe be open to the idea of a ceasefire with Hamas rather than a victory.
I love when they say permanent ceasefire. I said, what does that even mean?
Right. That's what we saw in between all the other rounds of conflict between Israel and Hamas. But I think, what people don't seem to get is either win this now or you're going back to exactly where you were on October 6th, and it's rinse and repeat.
And you're going to have millions of people that are even more angry.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to be angry no matter what, but, instead of a 7 days of war, 11 days of war, 50 days of war, you now have 500 plus with the same outcome. That sounds terrible. Now, some people may say, well, it's not the same outcome because, look, Hamas is more defeated than it ever has been. The destruction in Gaza, the rubble, etc. The tunnels have been mapped out, and many of them have been destroyed, whatever it is, 20% of them. But no, I don't think the mission is accomplished. And I do think that there is an element within sort of Bibi world that they are aware of this. I think that the right-wing government, for all of its flaws and all of its challenges, they're not going to let Bibi walk away from this war without some kind of a definitive marker where Israel says, we won.
I know many of the bereaved families have actually gone to Bibi, and his members of his government have said that if you don't eliminate Hamas, it's a disgrace to the memory of my son or my daughter. And that doesn't get as much play as the people who are fighting for live hostages, but it definitely is being communicated behind the scenes, and the people that are very upset at losing their son or daughter or brother or cousin on October 7th, it definitely has been communicated, and there is a block that is pretty vocal.
I have to say, I'm genuinely confused. I've met with some of the, the families and friends of those who fallen, and people from, the religious right, religious nationalist right, and their voices are just simply not heard. I watch a lot of Israeli media, and I just don't see them.
By the way, that's part of the reason I created this podcast. I had Asher Gedalia on. Hey, Asher, if you're watching. His brother, Yosef, fell on October 7th, and he is very rational, happens to be right-wing thinker, but oftentimes also with the segmentation of Israeli media, there's a certain segment of society that will only watch channel 11, 12, 13, and the other segment will only watch channel 14, and anything that comes from the opposite side is just fake.
Right.
Or has some sort of agenda. So therefore, you don't actually have a conversation. And one of the things, I had Nimrod Cohen's brother on the show. His family went to the ICC to go ask them to prosecute Bibi to end the war. Okay? But when I'm actually talking to them, many of the things they're saying actually align with people on the exact opposite side. It's just that because everything's very political, it just goes different wavelengths.
Yeah. No, but I think that's missing in our narrative here in the U.S. I think people just assume anyone who's lost a loved one, either as a hostage or on 10/7 or subsequently in battles in Gaza, that everyone just wants the war to end. I think that's probably not true for everyone. It may be the majority. May not be. I mean, maybe it's 50%, but certainly the narrative is cast a certain way, and we all accept it. By the way, I have no idea who watches Channel 13. I don't think anybody watches Channel 13.
Well, just when they have yeah, that's a good point. I'll say this: I spoke to David Tahar, his son Adir, amazing soldier in Golani, and he was the one that Palestinian Islamic Jihad actually murdered him, took his head, made a little music video, and then was keeping his head in an ice cream freezer. And then Shayat Shlosh rescued it, brought it back, and he was able to have a proper funeral with the whole body after many months. I can promise you, his family does not want Hamas to exist and would be very angry if those people were in charge after. So there's a lot of people like that, and it's. I think also just the can't underestimate the money that's behind some of the messaging, and that actually leads me to the last thing I wanted to touch base with you on. And you mentioned campuses before a little bit in Qatar. Do you think that train has left the station and that it's so far embedded in the education system that we don't really have a chance of saving it, or is there a way to cut this off and try to salvage traditional Western education?
You're asking the $7 billion to $20 billion question, and that's the money that we believe has been spent by Qatar in the American education system. Somewhere minimum $7 billion. I've heard as much as $20 billion. Who knows? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of influence. And really, I mean, let's unpack this for just a minute. Qatar is a country of 330,000 citizens. And they control 12% of the world's energy, give or take. And that gives them just endless amounts of money to throw at whatever they want. The question is, why are they throwing it at our education system? And by the way, not just higher ed, but also K through 12. What is it that an illiberal, Islamist, terrorist-supporting country wants with our education system? It is not the liberal values that we have tried to instill in our young people here in the United States. They don't want a piece of that. They want something else. Now, if you start to talk to the schools will say, well, you know, they're making these investments, they're not asking anything in return, or maybe they're endowing chairs or whatever. I happen to think that a lot of what we've been watching on campus is an indirect result of the money that Qatar has been giving these schools. In other words, the anti-Semitism springs up. It's coordinated, by the way, by people that have, like a professional background in doing so. These are, professional organizers. But so when the schools are forced to deal with this, they begin to realize, well, if we lose the Jewish contributors, the donors to our school, we're going to lose a $1,000 check here, a $5,000 check here, and maybe a $25,000. Anyway, let's say it adds up to a few million dollars. That is all replaceable by just going to Qatar or wherever else you go for your sovereign wealth injection into your school. And so what all this has done, in my view, is it's just made the schools unaccountable to the traditional alumni networks that used to be the backbone, the moral backbone of the school. It used to be that people like us would tell our schools, here's where I want you to direct our money. Here's the kind of things that we want you to reinforce among students. So we have our work cut out for us. There's some legislation that's winding through Congress now that may demand better disclosure. For me, I got to say, it's not just the schools any longer that have me worried. It's the amount of money that they've spent all over the country. I mean, the congressional baseball game every year, sponsored by the Qataris.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Is there even a baseball field in Qatar? What?
No, it's a baseball game here.
I know. I'm saying I don't think there's a base. I've been to Qatar. I was at Qatar I went to the World Cup.
Okay.
I'm saying I can't imagine that they even know what baseball is. What
doesn't matter. They're supporting a congressional thing that gives them power and influence.
How is the congressional baseball game up for sale? I don't understand that.
Anybody can sponsor anything if you want to put your name on a billboard. But I mean, the point is like, I mean, they just opened up an office for CNN in Doha. They got, these major conferences that they're putting on. There was just an AI conference where Will Smith and Malcolm Gladwell was featured. I mean, the amount of money that is spent and the amount of influence that is peddled, it's remarkable. And what I actually think we need to do is just to get an accounting of where all this money's going. We talk a lot about Chinese money and Russian money and how it's influencing American policy. I am fascinated to learn more about the totality of the Qatari kind of outflow. I think there's a massive amount there. I'm guessing it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and no one has bothered to look.
That's frightening.
Yeah. There's a term that people use. I mean, we saw it in places like South Africa, and we can see the results. They call it state capture, where individuals, mob families, foreign governments spend enough to control the levers of government. I don't think we're there yet in the United States, but I think we're well on the road if we don't stop this. And that's the thing that bothers me the most right now when I see Qatari influence on campus.
I think that the campuses, in my opinion, many of the campuses are just gone because it was interesting to me. People were saying, I can't believe the campuses after October 7th. I can't believe the campuses after October 7th. And then I actually saw that an article that I had penned when I was an undergraduate student was used in a lawsuit against it. And I said, yeah, that's because this has been going on for 10 years, 12 years. This is not surprising. It just didn't get this. You didn't have Instagram that was as viral as it is now, or TikTok. But none of it's really changed. It's just that they have a bigger platform and people are looking for stories. But the writing was on the wall. It was there. They had people everywhere, and while we're sitting there trying to debate about issues, about whether or not Israel is justified in having military control in Judea and Samaria, they're in the classrooms, just completely changing the curriculum and influencing people that way, which goes a lot further.
Yeah. Well, and just intimidating people,
Yeah.
organizing in an intersectional way, if I can use that word, engaging with others. I mean, I will say one of the amazing things for me was the realization that a group that I testified about before Congress in 2016 was the group that is behind a lot of the campus chaos that we're watching now.
What group is that?
American Muslims for Palestine.
Sure, yeah.
They're the group that incubated and created Students for Justice in Palestine. And I testified about them before Congress back in 2016. Nothing happened. Nobody took action. Nobody felt the need to, or they felt restrained. But bottom line is this group, comes roaring back and people are all shocked about it. Nothing shocking at all. They've been here and they've been right under our noses, and now we've got a major problem on our hands. And the biggest problem now is the schools seem to be tolerating it. Again, some of it might just be, because the Qataris have spent the money and obviated the need for people like us to be donors. But then there's the other part of it, which is,
I think they've won the ideas war. I think
yeah,
that's
the
problem.
professors
It's
are
the
already
ideas.
bought in, right?
When I was at Brandeis, the head of the number 2 at Students for Justice in Palestine supported cop killing when 2 cops got murdered in Brooklyn. And I wrote an article embedding the tweet in the article. And Mark Levin picked it up, and it ended up going everywhere. And there was a petition with thousands of people asking for me to be expelled for defaming her. I'm saying, no, she supported cop killing. But this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to create the intersectional DEI coalition where you're standing up for all sorts of insane ideas, but somehow it makes sense. And this is all the foreign money and all of these influence groups that are pushing it. I don't know how you undo that. They've been doing it for decades. But
Got a lot of work cut out for us.
absolutely. Dr. Jonathan Chanzer, I really appreciate you taking the time. God willing, will be much better days ahead, and we'll have better news on the hostage front, on everything going on with Israel and its neighbors. I appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
My pleasure, Daniel.